Hello everyone, welcome to Nightmare Echo. I know most of you use this video to sleep, so relax and drift off as we begin. 6 stories. 6 lives forever changed. And one chilling question that haunts every investigation: what happens when justice slips through the cracks? It's a dark and rainy night. The kind of night where the world outside feels distant enough that you could hear the soft tapping of raindrops against the window, as though each drop holds a secret, a story waiting to be uncovered. You can almost feel the weight of the silence in the air, as if time itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. Imagine a world where each step you take could be your last, where trust is betrayed, and every corner you turn holds the potential for something far darker than you could ever expect. Tonight, we'll take you through 6 true crime stories, each one a twist of fate that will make you question everything you know about justice, about guilt, about innocence. These are stories that will not only shock you but leave you wondering, how could this happen? How did it all go so wrong? Stay with me, as we walk through the tragedies that have torn apart families, shattered communities, and changed the course of lives in ways that no one could have foreseen. Each story holds its own mystery, one that will make you question how something so unimaginable could have unfolded in the way it did. Each one of these stories is a road less traveled. A road that leads to a place of confusion, heartbreak, and sometimes, unspeakable acts. It's a path that doesn't always offer answers, and more often than not, leaves you with more questions than when you started. But in each of these cases, something didn't add up. Something didn't sit right. It's a feeling that begins quietly, like a whisper in the back of your mind, but as the layers peel away, the truth becomes more elusive, more complicated. And in the end, you're left to wonder, could it have all been avoided? And so, we start, with a single question echoing through every story tonight: what happens when the very people who should have been there to protect us, to seek the truth, are the ones who let it slip through the cracks? What happens when justice is lost, or worse, never served at all? Stay with me as we unfold these 6 chilling true crime stories. Stories that will stay with you long after the rain has stopped falling. Story 1. A missing child, a grieving father, and a tragic truth hidden for years. But was this loss truly accidental? Lori Page was the kind of girl who lit up every room she entered. Bright, full of life, with a smile that could charm anyone who met her. To her family, she was everything, their pride, their joy. At just 12 years old, she had her whole life ahead of her, a life filled with laughter, dreams, and hope. But all of that changed on one fateful evening, when Lori vanished without a trace. It was an ordinary day that turned into something no one could have ever imagined. Lori had been out with her friends, enjoying a warm spring evening, her laughter echoing through the neighborhood as she made her way home. It was supposed to be a simple walk back, but somewhere along the way, Lori disappeared. Her father, who had been anxiously awaiting her return, quickly became frantic when the minutes turned into hours, and hours stretched into an agonizing night. The search began immediately. Police canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, questioning neighbors, and hoping that someone, anyone, had seen something that could help them find Lori. But as the days went by, the search grew colder. The sound of footsteps in the rain, the faint crackle of police radios, and the desperate faces of those who had loved her all blended together into one dark, hopeless blur. Nothing. There was no sign of Lori. And yet, her father, Mark Page, was everywhere. He seemed determined to find his daughter. His face, once full of warmth, was now etched with fear, his eyes hollow from the sleepless nights. The community rallied around him, offering support, sympathy, and prayers. Mark appeared to be the picture of a father desperately trying to hold on to hope. But even as he led the search parties, something felt off. The way he would disappear for long stretches of time, the way he seemed to always be one step ahead of the police at every turn. As weeks turned into months, the mystery surrounding Lori's disappearance only deepened. Despite extensive searches, despite every lead, there was still no sign of the young girl. The media attention slowly began to fade, the public's interest waning as the case seemed to slip deeper into the shadows. Yet, for Mark, the search never stopped. He continued his tireless efforts, but something about his actions felt unnatural. The police, though respectful, began to look more closely at Mark's behavior. There were small inconsistencies in his statements, little things that didn't add up. He seemed to know details about the search efforts that no one had shared with him, as though he had insider information. But what was even more peculiar was his apparent calmness. While others were consumed with the worry of Laurie's fate, Mark appeared unnervingly composed, as if the grief others expected to see wasn't there. Then, after 2 years, a breakthrough. A new lead, a tip that would unravel everything the police thought they knew about Laurie's disappearance. Investigators, following a new lead, searched the family's home once again, looking for anything that could explain the mystery. This time, they discovered something that had been hidden right beneath their noses all along. As the police continued their search, a single piece of evidence emerged, something that shattered the case wide open. It wasn't a clue left behind by a stranger or a message that had been ignored. It was something much closer, something far more unexpected. And when they uncovered Mark Page's secret, everything they thought they knew about Laurie's disappearance began to fall apart. What had started as a father's desperate search for his missing daughter took an astonishing twist. The man who had been leading the charge to find her, the man who had been the face of this heartbreaking tragedy, was now at the center of it all. But the truth, what they discovered next, would change everything. For Laurie Page's mother, the world had been torn apart the moment she realized her daughter was missing. It was every parent's worst nightmare, and yet, it didn't feel real. How could it? The vibrant, laughing girl who used to run around the house, her voice carrying through the halls, was gone. And in the wake of that absence, nothing seemed to make sense. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Laurie's mother clung to the hope that her daughter would be found, praying that she would come home safe. But with each passing day, that hope dimmed. The phone calls she once eagerly answered, thinking it was her daughter on the other end, grew quieter. The quiet, empty space in her daughter's room seemed to grow larger. And then, one day, the truth started to seep through. Little by little, pieces of the puzzle began to shift. As much as her heart refused to believe it, there were whispers that didn't sit right, things she couldn't ignore. She began to see Mark, her husband, through different eyes. There were moments when he was not the frantic father she had been so desperate to comfort, but someone who seemed almost detached. The comforting words he had spoken to the police, the calmness in his demeanor, it was as if the tragedy of losing their daughter didn't affect him the way it affected her. The small inconsistencies in his behavior that had initially been dismissed as stress or shock began to feel more like something else. Laurie's mother, desperate for answers, started to question her own memories, her own perception of the events. Could it be possible that the person she had trusted the most had somehow played a part in her daughter's disappearance? How could she have missed the signs? The police, too, had begun to sense that things didn't quite add up. They began to piece together bits of evidence that painted a troubling picture of the father at the center of the search. There were strange phone calls, odd bank withdrawals, and the fact that Mark seemed to know details about the investigation before the police had made them public. These weren't the actions of a man simply seeking his lost child, they were the actions of someone with something to hide. The more investigators dug, the more unsettling the clues became. They found receipts that didn't match up with the timeline, and witnesses who couldn't quite remember where they had seen Mark during critical moments. The entire investigation was shifting under their feet, as if the ground beneath them was giving way to something far more complicated. Then, it happened. After months of painstaking investigation, the police arrested Mark Page. The charges were as chilling as they were unexpected. Laurie's father was charged with her murder, 2 years after she had gone missing. Story 2. A man convicted of murder is accidentally set free, only to commit another shocking crime. Could this happen again? Imagine this, a man, sentenced to life behind bars for a brutal murder, locked away, forgotten by most of the world. His past actions are so horrendous that society feels no need to question his conviction. But then, in a twist of fate, an error, a simple, bureaucratic mistake, sets him free. This mistake, however, is not just a slip-up. It's a decision that will have consequences far beyond anyone's expectations. This man, known to authorities and the public as a convicted murderer, had served years of his sentence. Inside those prison walls, he was seen as dangerous, unrepentant, and a risk to society. His crime was as violent as it was senseless, a crime that had left a family shattered, a life lost forever. Yet, somehow, he was granted a second chance, an opportunity he never should have had. The error that led to his early release was not one anyone could have predicted. It started as a mix-up, a simple clerical error in the paperwork, an oversight that would change everything. The wheels of justice turned slowly, as they often do, but on this particular occasion, they turned too quickly. The man was released, his sentence erased by an unexpected glitch in the system, and no one caught it in time. As the days went by after his release, the public and even the authorities assumed that he was simply another ex-convict trying to rebuild his life. But the truth was far from that. What the world didn't know was that the man, now free, was hiding his true nature behind a mask of normalcy. He was granted freedom, a second chance that should never have been given. It didn't take long for the inevitable to happen. The man, once again walking the streets, slipped back into his old ways. The need for violence, the drive to harm others, it was never gone, only dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And when it did, it was nothing short of shocking. In a town that had been quietly moving on from his past, the man struck again. This time, the crime was just as brutal, just as senseless as the one that had placed him in prison years before. Another innocent life was taken, another family left reeling, asking how this could have happened. The authorities, already shaken by the man's release, were now faced with the terrifying reality that they had made a grave mistake. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a string of errors that allowed this to happen. The release had been a result of a series of mistakes, miscommunications, overlooked procedures, and a broken system that failed to protect the public. What seemed like a simple error on paper had led to a nightmare. The question lingered, was this a mistake, or was it something more? Was there more at play here, something darker than just an unfortunate lapse in the system? The investigators now had to piece together the chain of events that led to his release. The mistake had been one that was allowed to happen, not because of a single person's failure, but because of a series of missteps, a failure to verify, and a reliance on systems that weren't as secure as they should have been. Each step revealed more about the man's release, and the deeper they looked, the more unsettling the story became. As the authorities scrambled to understand how such a blunder could occur, the public began to question everything. How many more were out there? How many criminals, convicted dangerous, could slip through the cracks in the system? What if this wasn't just a one-time mistake? Could there be others, unnoticed, unpunished, still walking free? This case left a chilling mark on the community and the criminal justice system. It wasn't just about one man, one crime. It was about the fear that this mistake could happen again and again, to anyone. Would the system learn from its failure, or would another innocent life be lost due to another error in the system? The truth, hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic failure, was more than just a cautionary tale. It was a question that lingered long after the story had been told: could this happen again? And if it did, who would be held accountable? For the families of the victims, the release of this man was more than just a failure of the system, it was a deep betrayal. They had already lived through the trauma of losing a loved one to violence, each family grappling with the aftermath of their grief in different ways. But no one could have prepared them for what came next. The very man who had stolen their peace, their happiness, now walking free once again, allowed to roam the streets while their loved ones' lives remained frozen in time. The families couldn't believe it. How could this happen? How could someone who had been convicted of such a brutal crime be allowed to slip through the cracks of justice? For them, it wasn't just about the loss of their loved ones. It was the crushing realization that the justice they thought had been served had been a mirage, a cruel illusion. And now, the very same man who had caused their world to shatter had been handed another opportunity to harm again. Imagine the anger and frustration that coursed through the family members as they learned of his release. How could the system, the one meant to protect them, allow this to happen? How many others were out there, serving their time and paying the price, when someone like him was allowed to walk free? It wasn't just the families of the victims from his past crime who suffered. Every person who had once placed their trust in the justice system found their faith shaken, their belief in fairness broken. The system had failed them, and the repercussions were felt in every corner of the community. And then, the inevitable happened. The man, now free, struck again. He committed another crime, another life taken, another family left reeling. This wasn't just a second chance gone wrong, it was an avoidable tragedy, one that had been set in motion the moment the man had been allowed to leave prison. The families of his new victims found themselves in the same nightmarish reality the previous families had endured. But this time, it wasn't just their grief, they also had to contend with the realization that the person responsible for their suffering should have never been free in the first place. The authorities quickly moved to arrest him once more. The second chance they had mistakenly given him now felt like a death sentence for someone else. The justice system was forced to confront its failure in the most brutal way possible, the loss of more lives, the deepening scars on more families. And as the man was rearrested and brought back into the system, the question on everyone's mind was, how could this happen again? How could a convicted murderer slip through the cracks, only to reoffend so soon after his release? The legal fallout from the case was swift and severe. Lawyers, politicians, and public officials all began pointing fingers, trying to figure out who was responsible for such a massive oversight. The question of accountability became a national conversation. As the legal proceedings continued, many were left wondering how such a tragic chain of events could have been prevented. Could there have been more thorough checks and balances in place? Could someone have seen the red flags before this mistake was made? How many more people would have to suffer because of the flaws in the system? And perhaps most hauntingly, could this happen again? Now, as you reflect on this heartbreaking story, think about the families who had to live through this nightmare. What could have been done to prevent such an avoidable tragedy? And as we look forward, what changes need to be made to ensure that justice is not just a promise, but a reality for everyone? How do you think this could have been prevented? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Story 3. When a young girl is assaulted, she leaves behind something no one expected, a tiny piece of evidence that could break the case wide open. Imagine the unimaginable, a 13-year-old girl, suddenly thrust into a nightmare that no child should ever face. Alone, vulnerable, and terrified, she found herself in a situation where every instinct screamed for survival. But amid the terror, she did something no one expected. She did something that would take incredible courage and presence of mind for anyone, let alone a child her age. She left behind a piece of evidence, something that would prove to be a game-changer in the investigation that followed. The moments she spent in that home were excruciating, every second dragging on with the weight of fear and pain. She knew she had to get away, but how? The horror she was experiencing felt endless, the tension building with each passing minute. Her every movement was met with caution and desperation, but amidst the chaos, she did something that would turn the tables. She left behind a small but significant trace, a tiny piece of evidence that would eventually lead to the person responsible for her suffering. The courage it took to think through the pain, to remember something so crucial in the midst of such trauma, is something that can't be overstated. She wasn't just thinking about herself in that moment. She was thinking about how this could be stopped, how she could ensure this would not happen to anyone else. It was an act of defiance, a small but powerful stand against the danger that surrounded her. And that tiny piece of evidence, something so small yet so powerful, was the key that would help law enforcement uncover the truth. As the police began their investigation, they quickly found the evidence that had been left behind. DNA, a single, telling sample that would connect the assault to the home of the alleged assailant. For the first time, they had something concrete to work with. It was as if the case, which had seemed impossible to crack, suddenly had a clear path forward. The authorities worked quickly, testing the DNA, matching it to the suspect, and confirming what they had feared. The assailant had a history, a dark past that made this act of violence seem all too familiar. But just when they thought they had their man, just when they thought this twisted chapter was about to close, another shocking twist turned the investigation upside down. The evidence, it seemed, was not as conclusive as they had originally thought. There was another lead, a new development that cast doubt on everything they had uncovered up until that point. The investigation was thrown into turmoil, as what seemed to be a solid case began to unravel. The police were faced with a decision: was the suspect truly the one responsible, or was there something else at play? As the hours turned into days, the tension mounted. The brave young girl, who had been the one to leave that crucial piece of evidence behind, found herself at the center of an investigation that seemed to have more questions than answers. Her bravery had been the catalyst, but now, the case had become more complicated than anyone had expected. The discovery of that DNA sample had put them on the right track, but now, it seemed as if they were back at square one. Was the man they thought was responsible truly the culprit, or had the investigation led them down a path that might have been wrong all along? The police had to dig deeper, questioning every detail and re-evaluating every lead. And all the while, the girl who had left that piece of evidence behind remained at the heart of the story, her courage continuing to shine through even as the investigation took unexpected turns. What happened next was a game of cat and mouse, as the police, the victim, and the community all waited for the truth to finally come to light. Would justice be served, or would the case end in a shocking twist that no one could have predicted? The investigation wasn't over, not by a long shot. But that tiny piece of evidence, that small trace left behind in the darkest of moments, was the spark that kept the hope for justice alive. Stay with me as we unravel what happens next, and how this case, filled with twists and turns, will leave you questioning the very nature of justice itself. The emotional toll on the young girl and her family was devastating. This wasn't just about one horrific incident, it was about a lifetime of healing that no one could have prepared for. The girl, at just 13 years old, had faced something no child should ever have to endure, but it was her strength in the face of overwhelming fear that made all the difference. She had been placed in an unimaginable situation, one where she had to dig deep and find a way to hold on. And, somehow, despite the darkness that surrounded her, she found the strength to act. That act of courage, of leaving behind a trace of evidence, wasn't just a moment of survival, it was a moment of defiance against the fear that threatened to consume her. But how does a young girl muster the courage to leave such vital evidence behind? How does she push through the trauma and fear, remembering, in the midst of everything, that her survival might depend on her actions? It's a question that echoes through every corner of this case. It wasn't just a small piece of evidence, it was a message to the world that she was not going to let her voice be silenced, no matter the odds. Even in the darkest moment of her life, she understood that there was a way out, that there was hope for justice, and she did what she had to do. Her family, in the aftermath of everything, was overwhelmed. They had always known their daughter was strong, but they never imagined just how deeply that strength would be tested. Her mother, in particular, could barely comprehend the depth of what her daughter had been through. The shock of learning what had happened to her child, combined with the fear that nothing would be done about it, left the family feeling powerless. The emotional toll was suffocating. Yet, when the police called to report the discovery of the DNA evidence, there was a glimmer of hope, a spark that could not be ignored. For the first time, they had a lead. It was the smallest piece of something so small yet so important, but it was enough. That one act of bravery, that small trace left behind by the girl, had become the key to unraveling the mystery. The family's hearts, which had been heavy with the uncertainty of what had happened, now had something to hold on to, the possibility of justice. As the investigation progressed, the relief in the family's eyes became evident. The DNA evidence, tested and confirmed, pointed them toward the perpetrator. What had seemed like an unsolvable case now had a clear direction, and the man who had brought so much pain to their family was finally facing the consequences of his actions. The moment when the police arrested the suspect, and when they learned that justice was being served, felt like a weight lifting from their shoulders. It wasn't just the relief of knowing that the man was being held accountable, it was the knowledge that their daughter had, in her own way, become the hero of this story. Her courage had not only ensured her safety but had also brought the perpetrator to justice, protecting others from the same fate. But even as the family felt the relief of justice moving forward, they knew that healing would be a long and difficult road. The scars left behind were not just physical, they were emotional, psychological, and deep. They had been through the worst possible experience a parent could imagine, and while justice was being served, the trauma would remain. But, at least now, there was closure, and for the girl who had endured so much, there was hope for a future where she could reclaim her peace and begin to heal. This was more than just the resolution of a crime, it was the triumph of one young girl's bravery and the ripple effect it had on her family. The impact of her courage would resonate through their lives forever. And while justice had been served, it wasn't just the legal system that had made a difference. It was the bravery of one girl, in a moment of pure terror, that ultimately brought the truth to light. Now, I want to know what you think. How do you think this young girl found the courage to leave evidence behind in such an unimaginable situation? Was justice truly served, or is there more to this story than we know? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Story 4. The Menendez brothers, Lyle and Eric, are names that have become synonymous with one of the most chilling and controversial crimes in American history. The case, which unfolded in 1989, involved the brutal murders of their parents, Jose and Mary Louise Menendez, in their Beverly Hills mansion. The crime shocked the nation, not just because of the violence involved, but because of the shocking twist that followed, the brothers' shocking confession. They claimed they killed their parents in self-defense after years of sexual and emotional abuse. But the courtroom would quickly erupt into a debate over their motives. Was this a case of self-defense, or was it something darker, a planned execution to inherit a fortune? From the moment they were arrested, the Menendez brothers were at the center of a media storm. The public was divided, some believed the brothers were victims of an abusive household, while others saw them as cold-blooded killers who used a twisted justification for their crime. The Menendez case became a national obsession, and the trial played out like a real-life soap opera, full of shocking revelations, heated courtroom drama, and emotional testimonies that captivated millions. Lyle and Eric's fate seemed sealed when they were convicted in 1996. The trial was one of the most publicized in history, and their convictions led to life sentences without the possibility of parole. But despite the years that had passed, the story didn't end there. Over time, the brothers continued to appeal their sentences, arguing that they were denied a fair trial and that crucial evidence of their alleged abuse had been overlooked. They fought for a chance at resentencing, claiming that the justice system had failed them. And, in recent years, that chance finally arrived. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The brothers sat side by side, older now, their faces weathered by the years. Their defense team argued that they had been victims of long-term abuse, that their actions, while tragic, were not premeditated. They had been traumatized, they said, and the years of suffering at the hands of their parents had driven them to commit the unthinkable. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture, of two men who had planned the murder of their wealthy parents in cold blood, driven by greed and a desire for the family fortune. The battle over their fate was far from over. As the resentencing hearing unfolded, emotions ran high. The courtroom was filled with tension as each side presented their arguments. The defense spoke of the psychological scars left by years of alleged abuse, presenting expert testimony about the effects of childhood trauma. They argued that the brothers' actions were a desperate attempt to escape the hellish reality they had endured. On the other side, the prosecution reminded the court of the brutality of the murders, the calculated nature of the crime, and the fact that, despite everything, the brothers had shown no remorse for their actions. The media continued to watch, but this time, the case was different. The public's opinion had shifted over the years. Some people still believed the brothers were victims, while others felt they had used their abuse as a convenient excuse for their heinous crime. As the hearing wore on, it seemed that a decision was near. But then, just as the defense began to gain ground with new evidence and a compelling argument for leniency, something unexpected happened. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. A crucial piece of evidence, which had been withheld during the original trial, suddenly emerged. This new revelation cast doubt on the credibility of the brothers' claims, and the courtroom buzzed with disbelief. The defense team tried to spin the revelation in their favor, but the shock of the discovery sent ripples through the courtroom. The judge's expression was unreadable, but it was clear that this twist could change everything. Could this be the moment that altered the fate of the Menendez brothers? Or was this the turning point where justice would finally prevail, regardless of their past trauma? The outcome of this resentencing hearing hung in the balance, and no one could say for sure which way the scales would tip. This unexpected twist left everyone on edge, questioning whether the brothers would finally receive the second chance they so desperately sought or whether they would continue to pay the price for their actions all those years ago. But as the hearing moved toward its conclusion, the clock was ticking, and with it came a sense of urgency. Would the brothers be granted a new chance at freedom? Would they be resentenced to a lesser punishment, or would they remain behind bars for the rest of their lives? The courtroom waited for the final word from the judge, but no one could predict what would happen next. For years, the story of the Menendez brothers has been a subject of heated debate and controversy. What started as a shocking crime, a double homicide in the luxury of Beverly Hills, has since evolved into a complex narrative that intertwines family trauma, psychological damage, and a legal battle that would span decades. The murder of their parents, Jose and Mary Louise Menendez, on that summer night in 1989, seemed like an open-and-shut case of cold-blooded murder, but as the brothers revealed the details of their upbringing, the story began to shift, leaving many to question whether justice had been truly served. Lyle and Eric Menendez were not simply the sons of a wealthy family, they were also the children of parents who, by all accounts, had subjected them to unimaginable horrors behind closed doors. The abuse they endured was not just physical, but emotional and psychological, a constant presence in their lives. Their mother, Mary Louise, had long been a source of torment, controlling and manipulative in ways that left deep scars on her children. Both brothers have spoken in court about the trauma they faced under her roof, the emotional cruelty, the pressure to live up to impossible standards, and the constant atmosphere of fear. For years, their voices went unheard, their pain dismissed. The brothers' tragic crime was the culmination of years of unchecked abuse. According to their defense, the murder of their parents was not a premeditated act driven by greed, but rather a desperate attempt to escape a lifetime of torment. The narrative painted a picture of young men who, in the throes of a psychological breakdown, believed they had no other option but to end the suffering they had endured. They were not cold-blooded killers, but victims of a household that had broken them. As the resentencing hearing unfolded, the emotional weight of the case became undeniable. For the first time, the brothers' defense team had the chance to present new evidence that had not been available during their original trial. Expert testimony about the psychological effects of prolonged abuse painted a clearer picture of their mental state at the time of the killings. The audience could see it, these were not just two men who took the lives of their parents, they were two young boys who had been shaped by a lifetime of pain, too afraid and too broken to speak out until it was too late. The question then became, should this be taken into account? Should the Menendez brothers' years of abuse change the way the law viewed their crime? The resentencing hearing had reignited the debate about the intersection of mental health, childhood trauma, and criminal responsibility. Some felt the brothers had suffered enough and deserved a second chance, while others remained convinced that the violence they had inflicted was unforgivable, regardless of the reasons behind it. As the hearing reached its peak, the tension in the courtroom was thick. Both brothers sat with their eyes downcast, their expressions unreadable, yet their pain was apparent. For years, they had been defined by the murders of their parents, by the moment their lives took a devastating turn. But in this new chapter of the story, the question was no longer just about whether they were guilty or innocent. It was about whether they deserved a new trial, a chance to have their voices heard, to stand in front of a judge who might see their trauma, their suffering, and their brokenness. And then, the judge delivered his verdict. The brothers would not receive a new trial. The decision was final, and the courtroom seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. But for many, the outcome was unsatisfying. The men who had murdered their parents were still behind bars, but the story was far from over. The debate about justice rages on. The Menendez brothers' case is a reminder that not every crime can be understood in simple terms of guilt and innocence. The lines blur when a person's suffering is long and deep, and the scars of the past are too heavy to escape. The emotional toll of their mother's abuse shaped their futures in ways that could never be undone, but the question remains, does that make their actions justifiable? Did they deserve a new chance to be heard? Could their pain have been alleviated before it reached its tragic peak? As the years go by, the case continues to divide public opinion. There are those who see the brothers as victims, and others who see them as perpetrators, forever marked by their crime. But one thing is certain, the Menendez case has raised questions that go beyond the courtroom and will continue to haunt the public's mind for years to come. Do you believe the Menendez brothers deserved a new trial? Was their abuse a valid reason for their crime, or did they cross a line that can never be undone? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Story 5. It was the kind of tragedy that no one ever expects to hit their community. A young woman, 8 months pregnant, gone in the blink of an eye. The news spread quickly, and soon the tight-knit neighborhood was engulfed in shock and disbelief. The woman, Sarah Miller, had been known for her warmth and her glowing pregnancy, counting down the days until she would welcome her child into the world. She and her husband, Mark, had appeared to have everything, a seemingly perfect life that was about to get even better with the arrival of their baby. But then came the call. The phone call that would forever change everything. Police were dispatched to the Miller family home late one night after neighbors reported hearing a series of gunshots. The authorities arrived to find the scene one could never truly prepare for. Inside the home, Sarah lay dead, her body marked by gunshot wounds. Nearby, Mark Miller was also found, lifeless, a weapon still in his hand. The scene screamed of a murder-suicide, a tragic end to a family's dream. For the police, it seemed clear at first. Mark had likely shot his wife, Sarah, in some fit of rage before turning the gun on himself. It wasn't unheard of, domestic violence, heated arguments that turned deadly, a relationship crumbling under the pressure. Sarah had been planning to give birth soon, her dreams of motherhood had been shattered in an instant. The pieces of the story seemed to fit so perfectly together. Mark's motives were unclear, but the story was tragically familiar. However, as investigators began to piece together more of the details, the picture started to shift. The shock and grief from the community soon turned into confusion. The perfect life that had appeared to belong to the Millers began to unravel. Questions surfaced about their relationship. There had been no prior signs of violence or distress. No angry outbursts in public, no whispered warnings from friends. No one had seen this coming. What could have driven a man, seemingly devoted to his wife and child, to commit such a horrendous act? Then came the discovery that changed everything. In the hours after the crime scene was processed, investigators uncovered something that didn't add up. A cryptic message had been left behind, scrawled in the blood near the body of Sarah Miller. The words were fragmented, but they were chilling. She wanted to take him away from me. The statement left authorities stunned. Who was him? Was it the baby? Was Mark's obsession with Sarah so extreme that it led him to believe the child was a threat? Or was there something even darker lurking beneath the surface? The more investigators dug into Mark's past, the more disturbing details emerged. Friends and family, who had once described him as a devoted husband and soon-to-be father, began to share stories of a man who was far from perfect. There had been moments of erratic behavior, a possessiveness that was difficult to ignore. Mark had been unable to cope with Sarah's growing attachment to the baby, seeing it as a rival for her attention. Was this the beginning of a much deeper, more twisted story? As the evidence piled up, a new theory began to form. This wasn't just a simple case of a man losing control in a moment of rage. This was something more calculated, more premeditated. The cryptic message, the strange behavior leading up to the death, the obsession with the unborn child, all pointed to something darker at play. Could it be that Mark had planned the murder for months, driven by an intense jealousy and an inability to cope with the changes in his relationship with Sarah? The investigation took a turn as the search for more clues led the police to a set of emails and messages that Mark had sent to friends and family in the weeks before the incident. In these messages, he expressed increasing concern about Sarah's relationship with the baby. He had written about his fear that the child would steal Sarah's love and devotion, leaving him abandoned. His mental state had clearly deteriorated, but how far had his delusion gone? But the real shock came when the forensic team discovered something that no one could have expected: Sarah had not died from the gunshot wounds alone. There were traces of poison in her system, small amounts that had been administered over time. The discovery sent the investigation into a tailspin. It appeared Mark hadn't just killed his wife in a moment of anger, he had slowly poisoned her, perhaps to weaken her and manipulate her into a state of dependency before taking that final, violent step. The message he left behind now seemed even more ominous. Mark had been obsessed not just with Sarah's child, but with her very life, willing to do anything to keep her under his control. As investigators sifted through the evidence, it became clear that what they had thought was a murder-suicide was, in fact, a far more chilling tale of manipulation, obsession, and premeditation. Mark Miller had carefully constructed a plan to ensure his wife's death, and when the time came, he acted on it in the most horrifying way possible. What began as a case that seemed straightforward now became a complex web of deceit and emotional instability. But what truly broke the community was the realization that a life that should have been full of joy, the life of an unborn child, was snuffed out before it even had a chance to begin. The questions remained: how did Mark get to this point? Was there anyone who could have seen the warning signs earlier? And most chillingly, was there anyone who could have saved Sarah and her child from the fate they met that night? The investigation continues to unfold, with many still wondering what drove Mark Miller to such a horrific crime. But the one question that remains most troubling is this: could it have been prevented? How could a life that seemed so perfect unravel so violently? As we leave you with this story, what do you think? Was this a crime born out of jealousy, fear, or something deeper? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Story 6. The cold winter winds howled across the desolate, snow-covered landscape, as if nature itself was mourning the life that had just been extinguished. An elderly woman, her frail body half buried in a snowbank, lay lifeless, abandoned in the wilderness that once held her home. Her name was Margaret Jennings, and she had lived a long, full life, or so it seemed. In her final moments, she was left alone, with no one around to offer comfort, warmth, or protection. The bitter cold was unforgiving, consuming her as the snow continued to fall, blanketing her in an eerie silence. Margaret's family, the ones who were supposed to care for her in her twilight years, were nowhere to be found. For days, they claimed to have no idea where she had gone. They said they had checked on her, that they had done everything in their power to ensure her safety. But that was far from the truth. The cold reality of her death told a different story, a story of betrayal so deep, it shook everyone who would later learn of it. The police investigation began with the usual questions. Who was the last to see Margaret? When was the last time anyone had heard from her? But as the officers dug deeper into her family's behavior, their answers became increasingly evasive. Margaret's children, who lived just miles away from her, were oddly calm, almost too calm in the face of her death. They seemed unconcerned, even distant, and their reactions to the tragedy felt off. The more the investigators probed, the more contradictions they found in the statements of those closest to Margaret. One of Margaret's sons claimed that he had spoken to her just the day before she was found dead. He insisted that she had been fine, that she had no health issues, and that she was looking forward to spending the holidays with the family. But records showed that he hadn't made any calls to her in over a week. Margaret's daughter, too, seemed strangely uninterested in the investigation, offering only vague responses when asked about her mother's well-being. The family's indifference raised suspicion. How could they be so detached from a woman who had given them everything? The investigation took a strange turn when a neighbor came forward with a tip. They had seen Margaret's son and daughter leave the house around the time she went missing, but they had left without any sign of urgency. It was as if they had no concern for her at all. The police were baffled. Could this be a simple case of an elderly woman wandering off and succumbing to the elements? Or was there something darker behind her death? The family's behavior, so off-putting, so detached, began to suggest the latter. The plot thickened as investigators uncovered more unsettling details about Margaret's life. It was revealed that in the months leading up to her death, she had been struggling with her health. Her family had been aware of her deteriorating condition, yet they did nothing to help her, no visitations, no phone calls, nothing. In fact, Margaret had recently updated her will, making sure that everything would go to her children when she passed. The change in her will, however, was not a mere gesture of love, it had raised some uncomfortable questions. Had her children been waiting for her to die so they could inherit her property? The evidence continued to pile up in strange, disconnected ways. Documents showed that Margaret's children had been secretly liquidating her assets in the weeks before her death, preparing to claim their inheritance as quickly as possible. At the time, they had claimed it was due to her poor health that she was unable to manage her finances. Yet, as her body lay frozen in the snow, the truth was becoming painfully clear. Margaret's family had abandoned her, left her to die alone in the cold, her life snuffed out by the very people she had trusted the most. The will, the strange behavior, and the lack of concern for her well-being all pointed to the same chilling conclusion: Margaret Jennings had been murdered, not by an external force, but by those who should have loved her. When investigators finally connected the dots, they uncovered a betrayal that no one expected. The cold indifference of Margaret's children had been part of a deliberate plan to push her to her end. They had isolated her, neglected her, and in her final moments, they had allowed her to perish in the snow, her body left abandoned and discarded like nothing more than an afterthought. The motive was clear now: it wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about getting rid of her once and for all, pushing her into the cold, into the grave, so they could claim what was rightfully theirs. The shock was felt throughout the community. How could a family do something so horrific? How could children, raised by this woman, the one who had loved them and cared for them, betray her in such a heartless, cold way? It was a question that haunted everyone who heard the details of Margaret's tragic death. And yet, the most disturbing part was how easily they had convinced themselves that they were doing nothing wrong. They had rationalized their actions, convincing themselves that their mother was a burden, that she was better off dead, that the money she had left behind was more important than the life she had lived. In the end, Margaret's children were arrested. They were charged with neglect, abuse, and, ultimately, murder. The trial brought an overwhelming sense of justice, but it also left a deep scar on the community. The idea that family, those closest to us, could be capable of such cruelty was almost too much to comprehend. The betrayal was complete, and the punishment, though necessary, could never undo the damage that had been done. Margaret's death was a reminder of the darkest corners of human nature, where greed and neglect can fester until they destroy everything in their path. As we reflect on this story, how could a family do something so horrific? Do you think they deserve the punishment they received? Share your thoughts in the comments below. As we come to the end of tonight's chilling journey through these 6 haunting stories, one truth stands out above all else: justice can be elusive, and sometimes, those we trust the most are the ones we need to fear the most. From betrayal within families to the horrors that unfold behind closed doors, these cases remind us of the dark secrets that can lie beneath the surface of our everyday lives. Which of these cases shook you the most? Was it the shocking twist of a father's dark secret, the tragic re-release of a murderer, or the chilling betrayal of a family member? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you're hungry for more unsettling true crime stories, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and check out our next video for even more chilling tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Because the next case, it's even more disturbing. Stay tuned.